Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is your module on The Old Man and the Sea, written by Ernest Hemingway. I am Shormila Mojumdar, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. Now, as you know, Ernest Hemingway was an American novelist. The Old Man and the Sea was written in 1951 and published in 1952. But before we go into the discussion of the text, I would like to talk about its form because it's a very short piece of writing. It's a fiction, so it has variously been described as a novel and also as a novella. Now, what's the difference between a novel and a novella? In English language, the diminutive form is sometimes indicated by this kind of changes from a novel to a novella, something like this. So, a novella is a shorter novel. Now, it may not be as simple as that so far as the form of the work goes. Because the difference between a novel, a novella, a long story and a short story, they are quite delicate and the borders are sometimes overlapping, and it is not definitely decided only by the length of the narrative, so to say. So, in a way, I feel the Old Man and the Sea can be described also as a long short story. Now, this is oxymoronic, no doubt. You know what an oxymoron is. This is a figure of speech in which you place two words which are contradictory in meaning side by side, and therefore there arises some kind of an ambiguity in the meaning of the statement. Now, let me talk about the short story first, because the short story is not necessarily a story which is short, though it often is. Edgar Allan Poe, the American short story writer, poet and critic, he defined short story by the duration of its reading time. So he says that short story is something which should be read at one go, at one sitting. Now, in this age of very short duration span, which is causing real concern to the educators and psychologists and all these people, so how long will a person be able to read at a stretch may become a matter of debate and convenience, and there are several other considerations as well. So, let's go back to Poe, where he says that a short story is a story where there is unity of impression. And now, what does he mean by this unity of impression? He also says it is singleness of impression. So, what he means that when you finish reading a short story, you are left with one single unified impression. Now, what is so unique about it? The fact that most of the time when you finish reading a novel, what happens that you are left with multiple impressions. Why? Because a novel may have a very long period to cover. There may be many characters, there may be a plot and several subplots, and so there may be many issues, themes which are there in the text of the novel. So, normally what happens when you finish reading a novel, you get multiple impressions, you retain those multiple impressions, but as Poe thought that when you finish reading a short story, a good short story, an ideal short story, you should preferably be left with one single impression. Now, how does it coordinate with the idea that it's a short story that so short, preferably that could be read at one sitting? Now, let me tell you something. Size, length, etc. It does matter, because if you are writing 300 pages, for example, you cannot probably write about 2 characters and 1 incident which will leave you with one single impression. If you are writing 30 pages, it's fine. So, the length in a way determines, controls the treatment in the narrative, and that is why in a short story you have maybe 2-3 characters, you don't have subplots, you don't have too many incidents happening, and thereby the short story writers manages to leave the singleness of impression or the unity of impression. Now, so when we come to this description of long short story, what we mean by this is that this is a short story in spirit, in character, that it has 1 or 2 characters, 1 or 2 incidents, no subplots, and it leaves one single unified impression, but it is slightly longer than average short stories. But there again I can cite examples. For example, Chekhov's word number 6 runs to about 100 pages, and there you go with Catherine Mansfield's short story The Fly, which runs to 7-8 pages, something like that. So, from 7-8 pages to 100 pages, everything has been accommodated within the definition of a short story. So, length matters, and it doesn't at the same time. So, the length determines the kind of treatment that the subject and the subject matter receive in the text. At the same time, the length doesn't matter in the sense that it varies widely. What matters is how it is being treated. The subject and matter is being treated, how the writer is executing his scheme, and what kind of impression he leaves at the end of the story. Now, if I describe The Old Man and the Sea as a long short story, which has variously been described as a novella also, I will like to point out that there is only one character in the short story, so to say, because there is the boy Manolin who appears occasionally. It is Santiago, the Cuban fisherman, who is the sole character in the narrative, and there are fleeting appearances of other fishermen towards the end of the narrative, that's it. And there is the huge fish Merlin, if you consider Merlin to be another character. So, there are only 2 characters. And what is the story all about? That Santiago, who had been going without a single fish for 84 days, goes out on the 85th days, and the huge fish Merlin, he catches the huge fish Merlin, and it takes about 3 days for him to bring the catch back to the shore, which he cannot really do because during these 2 days the sharks come and they eat up the fish Merlin. So, when he comes back to the shore, it's actually only the carcass of the fish that remain with him. So, you see, not much of incident, not too many characters, not a single subplot, and at the end of the story you retain the impression of this epic struggle between man and nature, the tragic story of a fisherman who loses almost everything in this epic struggle. So, essentially you are left with one single impression. So, that is why I would like to describe it more as a novella than as a novel. Well, this module will would try and analyze one of Ernest Hemingway's most popular texts and look into what makes this one of the most loved and best read novels almost 6 decades after its publication. The focus of the article would not only be on the character of the heroic fisherman and the problematic relationship that he shares with Mother Nature, but also on diverse issues like whether the novella can be considered a Christian parable or the issues of a rapidly changing world order in a small fishing village in Cuba. So, Hemingway's world is a predominantly masculine, physical world, and he has been criticized by none other than Faulkner for being less imaginative, concentrating more on the physical. But when he was asked about the symbolism of this story, he said the fisherman is a fisherman, the fish is a fish, the struggle is a struggle, the boy Manolin is a boy, and there is nothing more into it. But if you read the story carefully, you will find that, well, the fish is a fish, no doubt about it, but here probably for the first time Hemingway brings in symbolic meaning which seems to be very natural in the context of this story, the fisherman and the sea, the fish and the epic struggle, and the symbolism is almost natural there, and so that complaint against him is squarely refuted by Hemingway, that he can also bring in less physicality into his stories, less masculinist, hegemonistic kind of prioritization in his story. Structurally, The Old Man and the Sea is a 3-part sea story: departure, journey, and return, or entry to a new world. The story also loosely follows the 3-part structure of a rite of passage: separation, the liminal or in-between phase, and reintegration. But it is in the analysis of the character of Santiago that the critics have their loyalties and opinions sharply divided. Now, you see, before going into how the critics felt about the character of Santiago, let's talk about this pattern in the novel, that it is departure, it is journey, and it is return, which also runs parallelly to the pattern. This is a 3-part structure, a rite of passage, that it is separation, it is the in-between phase, and it is the reintegration. Now, you see, the fisherman Santiago lives for this particular epic journey just for 3 days, because he leaves on the 85th day and he comes back on the 87th day. So, in terms of passage of time, it's not really huge. But you see, the way he struggles and the way he kind of loses the battle actually foregrounds Hemingway's concern for a changing world order. Because when he was writing in the 1950s, America was fast becoming an industrialized nation. And you know, with industrialization, it's not only the huge factories were coming up, but the entire value system was changing. The day-to-day life of people were changing. People were becoming more mechanical, more materialistic, running after money, and the old world values were being very fast eroded. And this Cuban fisherman, Santiago, he represents the old world values, and when it comes to fishing, for example, he is a man who has a skill. Fishing is a skill, and that skill is not either abated or restricted by mechanical tools, because the new generation fishermen who were simultaneously fishing along with Santiago, they were using new age tools, and Santiago was declared a salau, an unlucky man. This is the worst form of unluckiness, so to say, because he was going without fish for 84 days, and there were other fishermen who had their regular haul, but these fishermen, they were taking the help of various tools, and so their skill was less, and Santiago was there who didn't have access to any mechanical tool, only the skill that mattered, and he fished with the help of his skill. So you see, there is a clear sharp divide between the old world, its practices and values, and the new world with its new practices and new values. And you see, before again we go into the analysis of the character of the fisherman Santiago, we will have to remember also that Santiago, that the name itself, Santiago, is actually a very Christian name. And though Hemingway squarely refuted the idea that there was obvious symbolism in the story, but as you read the text, it becomes clear that the Christian references are there, and it almost replicates a biblical story of man's struggle against nature, and the way man realizes the futility of this struggle, because nature is so superbly powerful that man doesn't stand even a chance to win against her, but at the same time it's man's fate that they should struggle against nature. Well, now coming to the character of the old man, that is Santiago. No matter how divided the opinions of critics are, they agree upon the fact that Santiago represents a noble and tragic individualism, revealing what man can do in an indifferent universe which defeats him, and the love he can feel for such a universe and his humility before it. If you consider the title of the novel, it is Old Man and the Sea. The fish is not there, nowhere in the title. Though the struggle is apparently between the man and the fish, probably the novelist was thinking in a different line. He was juxtaposing an individual and a very powerful manifestation in nature, that is the sea. So it is a confrontation, it's a negotiation between the old man and the sea. So the old man and the sea also represents fierce individualism, which, may I remind you, is important characteristic features of American thought and consequently of American literature. We have to go back a long way in history to remind us that America was established as a British colony, and America has never been monarchical. So when America, after the American Revolution, became an independent sovereign country, the struggle was, the endeavor was to the establishment of democracy, and a democracy which recognized the importance of individual, the worth of individual, the possibility of the individual, and the rights of the individual. So in a way, Santiago represents this American individualism, and also this American individualism is secular, but Santiago also represents the Christian world, in which here is a man who is struggling against nature and is being squarely defeated by her. One important theme of The Old Man and the Sea is one which deals with luck and the laws of chance. Santiago thinks to himself that while it is important to be lucky, it is also important to be exact so that he can take advantage of his luck when it comes. He discusses lucky numbers and lottery tickets with Manolin, and and it is Santiago's reputation as the Salau, the worst form of being unlucky, that at the end costs him his apprentice. Santiago believes that he transgressed and violated his luck by going out too far out into the sea. So you see, the superstitious believes that he was very unlucky, and you know what happened? His apprentice, the young boy called Manolin, who used to go out shipping with him, he was taken away from Santiago, and his parents employed him with somebody else. So people who were luckier, who were lucky people, who had their regular haul. So Santiago in a way believes in this superstition that man has a limit, man has a boundary beyond which he cannot go, and if he goes, he meets with dire consequences. And so luck is there, and there is the laws of chance. So if you are lucky, the chance works in your favor, and if you are not, even if you get chance, you cannot properly utilize it. And he felt that why he could not, he felt he could not properly utilize the chances, because he transgressed, he went beyond the limit of an individual. So he has ventured far out into the sea, which is both metaphorical and physical. Physically he goes far out into the sea, and metaphorically he transgresses the limit. Throughout the text, we find Hemingway interrogating a new emerging world order, with the old values rapidly diminishing and being replaced by a new which focuses too much on technology, profit and exploitation. Santiago is a remnant of the former, while the trade is being usurped by the young and the ambitious fishermen, whose lack of skill in fishing is compensated by the modern electronic equipment they arm themselves with. So this is something I have already talked about, because I already argued that Santiago represents an old order, and the new order is coming to replace the old order. The old order had only skill, and the new order has technology to aid the skill that the new fishermen had. Well, there were two film adaptations of this novel. I think it's two. First one had Spencer Tracy as Santiago, and the second one had Anthony Quinn as Santiago. And I distinctly remember a black and white frame from the first movie, that is featuring Spencer Tracy, that Tracy was carrying the mast like a crucifix. So the Christian allegory in the novel is made even more graphically clear by the director of the movie, where Santiago is presented as Christ carrying his crucifix. The novella is much less weighed toward the concept that dominated the earliest novels, that man is punished by a hostile universe. Santiago acknowledges himself as the author of his own ruin. He knows that he has tried to go beyond the limits of human possibility in making his choices and obeying his imperative, and he knows that he must be punished for it. His suffering, which to many is much more than he deserves, is one of the eternals of tragedy. Now, there is a shift in Hemingway's attitude to the predicament of humanity. Previously, it was humanity which is weak, unequal, and it is kind of fighting against a hostile universe and squarely defeated. Now there is a slight, very subtle change in his attitude. Here Santiago is punished. Whether the punishment is commensurate with his wrongdoing, if it is a wrongdoing at all, that is to be debated. But Santiago himself recognizes that he has transgressed, he has gone beyond the limit, and that is why he is being punished. So there is a slight shift in Hemingway's attitude. Considering the old man and the sea as a specimen of a classical tragedy opens up more fertile avenues to consider. The sharks act as the nemesis to Santiago, overreaching. If the old man had not gone further to sea than his proper limits, he would not have caught a fish big enough to tow him to sea for 3 days. If the fish were not so big, he could have put it butchered inside the boat and kept it safe from sharks. If it were not big enough to pull him to sea for 3 days, the sharks would not have had time and space to destroy it completely. The end was in the beginning, when he first went too far out the stream of blood that went a mile into the sea and drew the shark was simply a step in an inexorable process more than well advanced. So some critics have seen the pattern of classical tragedy in this novella, that Santiago is a tragic character who clearly had hamartia. If you remember your Aristotelian text, you know, tragic figure, the fall of a tragic figure happens because of a fatal flaw in his character, and sometimes it is also described as an error of judgment, which is called hamartia. And probably Santiago's hamartia was to venture far out into the sea. It was an error of judgment on his part, and so he was punished for his error of judgment. So some critics have seen a clear Greek tragic pattern in the narrative. Critics have also seen parallels of the old man's struggle and in his toil against a malignant universe, against all odds, with that of Sisyphus pushing a boulder of stone against the mountain and destined to do it forever. The particular defeat on which the novel focuses, the catching of the huge marlin that will be devoured by sharks, is obviously Sisyphean in its combination of prolonged, repetitive, painful struggle and the clear-eyed knowledge of that struggle's ultimate futility. The old man had once gone through a period of barrenness when he could not catch a single fish for 87 days. So you see, there is not only a pattern of Greek tragedy in the text. Classical myth has also been evoked to parallel the situation of Santiago the fisherman. It's the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was condemned to endeavor at something which he will never be able to accomplish. So he was perpetually, forever struggling to push a boulder against a mountain, and this old man Santiago did something like this because he endeavored, he struggled, the struggle was painful but it bore no fruit, it was futile, and so as the novel ends, he is seen talking to Manolin about the next adventure into the sea and the kind of haul he is likely to get and all these kind of things. So endeavor without any result. This is the moral of the Sisyphean myth. Reading The Old Man and the Sea, one is struck by the title with the very conspicuous absence of the marlin in it. The heroic struggle of the old man then seems to be against a greater enemy, the sea. The marlin and the mako sharks are nothing but agents of this very hostile universe. This has led to a lot of speculation about man's position in the larger scheme of things, where the sea becomes symbolic of a malignant fate, whimsical and arbitrary, almost symptomatic of the role that the gods would play in the Greek tragedies. So you see, in the Greek tragedies, gods are playful, they play with the destiny of man, the gods don't show any consideration, and the somewhat malignant gods are there in the Greek tragedy, just as they spoil human lives, and in a way the old man and the sea reproduces this Greek tragic pattern. Hemingway's attitude to nature and her bounties has come under severe criticism. That claim is credible if we examine some of Hemingway's later writings on fishing and hunting. it is balanced by other recent criticism which recognizes that even though Hemingway extended his sense of community and interdependence to animals in The Old Man and the Sea, the novel remains a theater of cruelty with a flesh-piercing array of images and terms that complicate the novel's renderings of nature's wonder. Well, probably at the beginning of this discussion, I talked about the world of Hemingway being exclusively physical, because there are stories of African safari, of hunting, and some of these hunting stories can also be described as having almost epic proportion, and so Hemingway has come for severe criticism about his attitude to nature. And in this particular novella, though he is trying to establish a harmonious relationship between man and nature and other animals, at the end of this story, it's as it is said, it's a theater of cruelty. It's a lot of blood and flesh piercing images, and at the end only the carcass of the huge fish remains, which other fishermen divide among themselves. Somebody takes the tail, somebody takes the head. So you see the predatory imagery continues till the end of the novel. Santiago rejects those who masculinize the sea, but against his view of Mother Sea as a beautiful, kindly and generous feminine provider, a belief that in many respects does temper his behavior toward her, he sets an opposing view of feminine nature as cruel and chaotic, spawning poisonous creatures, sudden storms and hurricanes. There is a mutual wounding of the hunter and the hunted, so much so that the thin line that distinguishes between them is blurred. Santiago is out further than ever to explore the sea's reaches, and the sea too is hostile, withholding them from the aged Aegon. Whereas in earlier Hemingway works, the protagonists, matadors and trophy hunters, seem to do most of the stabbing and shooting. In The Old Man and the Sea, the inflicting of wounds is mutual. So you see what happens in Hemingway. In Hemingway and earlier works, it was a one-way traffic, and in this novel it's a two-way traffic. It is both the hunter and the hunted who are injured, who are wounded. The old man Santiago, when he finally comes back to the shore with the carcass of the fish marlin, he was exhausted, he was wounded, he was almost falling off to sleep. He barely dragged his tired body to bed and was lost in deep sleep. So you see, here the hunted and hunter binary is somewhat blurred. So in a way, the hunter becomes hunted and the hunted becomes hunter. When asked whether the novella can be considered to be a metaphor for something else, Hemingway was categorical in his denial. He remarked, "There isn't any symbolism. The sea is the sea, the old man is an old man, the boy is a boy, and the fish is a fish. The sharks are all sharks, no better and no worse. All the symbolism that people say is shit." But despite this refutation from the author himself, readers and critics alike have striven to identify certain strands within the text which make this work a Christian parable of heroism and humility. Elements within the text have risen beyond their surface interpretation to acquire symbolic importance and value. None more so than the great American baseball player Maggio. Well, you see, this is a story of epic struggle. Here is a man, an old fisherman who represents the old world, and there is a binary between the old world and the new world of technology and profiteering and mechanization. In spite of these both tragic and epic implications in the novel, or no, in the novella, what Hemingway has done, you see, he has used one particularly contemporary figure and something which is exclusively American. He has used it as a kind of rallying point, as a metaphor. It is the American baseball player Maggio. You know, baseball is something which is hugely popular in America, and successful baseball players are hero worshipped all over America. And Santiago is in Cuba, he is not in America, and he is of Spanish origin, but he is a huge follower of Maggio, and he draws his strength from Maggio. He believes if Maggio plays well, that augurs well for him. If Maggio is not that successful, that's a bad omen for him. So in a way, he identifies himself with Maggio, and thereby in this particular story, the baseball player assumes the potential of a tragic hero as well. Joe Maggio features in the story as a constant source of inspiration to the battered Santiago. He invokes the baseball legend to draw emotional and spiritual sustenance during moments when all hope seems lost. Maggio, like Santiago, was a champion, a master of his craft, and in baseball terms, an old one, playing out of the last years of his glorious career, severely handicapped by the pain of a bone spur in his heel. In his strained back and his cut and cramped left hand, he too is an old champion who must endure the handicap of pain, and whose return to baseball glory at the fag end of his flagging career insinuates a phoenix-like return for Santiago as well, and yet it stands for something more poignant and to a certain aspect sinister. Santiago's fixation with Joe Maggio is not a casual one. Certainly it's not, and as I argued that Maggio also assumes a tragic proportion. And some critics have also argued that that Santiago can actually be identified with the author himself. So with this particular novella, he came back in a big way to the scene of American writing. He was hugely appreciated for it. He was awarded the Pulitzer in 1953. 1 year after the publication of this novel, and Nobel for the same novel the next year, that is 1954. The Old Man and the Sea can be read as a document espousing typically Christian values. Perhaps in part because of its theme of the redemptive value of suffering, it has been read as a Christian allegory. The protagonist's name is that of Saint James in Spanish. The associations with fish, the mention that the old man's instinctive utterance of "ah" may be reminiscent of the sound emanated by Christ when the nails went through his flesh, are all telltale hints to this claim. They are further emphasized by the symbolic value of the old fisherman as he carries the mast cross-like up the hill to his shack, and as he lies exhausted on his bed. And this is what I was trying to talk about when I very cursorily mentioned the first film that was made on this novel. Santiago is a projection of Hemingway himself. It is only half developed, sometimes almost ostentatiously visible in this. Santiago is Hemingway. Once the greatest of all in his Meter, but now fallen and derided Hemingway, who will come back from scorn and again defeat all others with a master achievement. Hemingway, who considers he has done it and sees his last just prize wrested from him by a hostile reviewing establishment. Santiago is thus Hemingway as artist and champion, as well as the universal artist. So you see, this novel, this very short novel, which has also been described as novella, has layers of meaning attached to it, and the more you read it, the more the subtle, nuanced issues in the novella come across. And to sum up, I may say that Santiago's struggle is an epic struggle, Santiago's fate is a tragic fate, and Santiago's story represents strands in contemporary history. So you can see there are layers and layers of meaning, and the more you read it and read it more attentively, the further you are likely to get into the meaning of the novella, which to your delight will reveal its significance, its charm, and its final enjoyment. Thank you.